who in the room has ever met somebody famous? Who in the room has ever met somebody famous? Maybe somebody that's influential or has a following. In fact, let's do this. Somebody want to tell me somebody famous that you've met? Pierre. He met Toby Mac. Okay. A musician, Toby Mac. Ricky Henderson. Any Oakland A's fans in here? There's two. Kenneth, who have you met? Okay. I don't know who that is. That's cool. Somebody else. Justin, who have you met? He wins. Kevin Costner wins. Gordon, who have you met? Marvin Gaye. Marvin Gaye wins. Anybody else, somebody you met famous, Mike? Okay. I'll act like I know who that is. Okay. So a few years ago, I met somebody famous. So my buddy and I, we were in Nashville, and there's a guy named Dave Ramsey. So Dave Ramsey, he's a financial guy. He has a radio show and all that, and he has his headquarters in Nashville. So my buddy and I, we were like, hey, let's go to his headquarters. Let's go see what it looks like because we're here. So we went there, and his radio show was going on while we were visiting. I thought that was cool. So we go in there, and he's doing his radio show behind glass. So we're watching him do his radio show. This is the real Dave Ramsey. And then there was a worker that came up and she said, hey, would you like to meet Dave Ramsey? What? Yes, we want to meet Dave Ramsey. So there's a commercial break in his radio show, and Dave Ramsey, he comes out, and there's a line of some different people and to go to meet him. So we get in line, and I was trying to play it cool. I'm just going to go meet Dave Ramsey and just say what's up to him, I might give him my phone number or something in case he needs any financial advice or something. I was trying to play cool, but I was totally like a fanboy. I was like, this is Dave Ramsey. So we get up to meet him, and my buddy, he's just like, whatever. He's like, not a big deal. Okay. But I'm like, Dave Ramsey in the flesh. So we get up there, and right before we meet him, my friend and I we're like, what are we going to do? This doesn't really happen unless we take a picture. So what we decided to do is we shook his hand, and then, you ready for this? And then we got a picture with Dave Ramsey. Aren't you guys so impressed? I'm glad that two of you guys are impressed. But here's the crazy thing, right? I was wowed because I was in the presence of greatness. Being in the presence of greatness, human greatness, has a strange effect on us. Whether it's Ricky Henderson or Marvin Gaye or Kevin Costner or whoever. Sometimes you get around influential people and it affects us in certain ways. And if being around human greatness has an effect on us, how much more should being aware of the presence of an almighty, great God affect us? I don't know if you've ever stopped and thought about how great God really is. But I was thinking about this the other day. I was reading about this, that if you look up in a night sky, maybe you go out camping or something, and you go out and you try to count the stars. You guys ever try to count the stars before? The most stars you can count with the naked eye, the astronomers tell us, you can actually see, is 10,000 stars. Can't see any more than that. 10,000. But in our galaxy alone, there are 3 septillion stars. This is 3 septillion. In case you're wondering, that's 24 zeros. This is how many stars there are in our galaxy. And God created that. And God's immensity and God's power should have an effect on us. It should shape how we live our lives. In fact, one person said this. They said, what comes to your mind when you think about God determines everything else about you. What comes to your mind when you think about God determines everything else about you. If you think that God is like this cruel dictator, if you think that God is just kind of like a side piece that I just go to him when I want him, or if you think God is just somebody that kind of pops in when he wants to pop in and then pops out, but how you think about God determines everything else. It determines what you value. It determines how you see the world. And the incredible thing about God that we're about to see is that God isn't just great and majestic, but God is personal. God is personal. In Exodus chapter 6, there's a group of people that they were discouraged, they were disillusioned, and they felt like God had forgotten about them. But what God wanted these people to do was just see who he was. Because if they could see who Jesus, who Yahweh, who God was, in turn, the natural response would be to trust him and surrender to his path for their lives. And could it be that the reason why sometimes we have a hard time following and trusting him is because we have a hard time seeing him for who he is? Let's pick it up in Exodus chapter number 6, verse number 2. If you are excited to be in church this morning, would you say amen? Amen. That is right. This is what the scripture says in Exodus chapter 6. God spoke to Moses, telling him, I am the Lord. This is who I am. In verse number 3, he says, I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as God Almighty, but I was not known to them by my name, the Lord. Now, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they were the patriarchs of this nation of Israel. We could say they're the equivalent to the George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln of our country. They're like the old school leaders. They're the guys that started all this. And God had spoken to them and told them that he was almighty, that he could do great things. But God tells Moses here, he says, I am the Lord, which comes from a Hebrew word meaning Yahweh, which means the self-existent one that's going to fulfill his promises. The patriarchs, the old school guys, the guys that you read about, yeah, I appear to them as almighty, but I am appearing to you as Yahweh. I'm going to fulfill my promises. Verse number 4, this is what he says. He says, this is God speaking, I also established my covenant with them. Who's them? This is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He established a covenant. Now, a covenant is like a promise, but it's more than that. A covenant comes with obligations and responsibilities. So, for example, when you get married, you don't just make a promise with your spouse, but you make a covenant with them. In sickness and in health, there are things that go along with the covenant. God said, I made a covenant, so I have responsibilities to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is my covenant to them, that I'm going to give them a land of Canaan, the land they lived in as aliens. Now, some of you guys saw that word aliens, and it totally just tripped y'all out. Like, you guys just thought of like a UFO or something. This just means that wasn't where they're from. They're from a foreign place, and they were there. So God had promised these people that he was going to take them to the land of Canaan. But the problem was, right now, they were nowhere near Canaan. And Canaan was a really great place. Canaan represents the place that you want to be. But right now, they were nowhere near Canaan. They were in a place where you wouldn't want to be. This is where they were in verse number 5. He says, furthermore, I have heard the groaning of the Israelites. Any of you guys ever groan and like complain? Sometimes our dog, he'll be laying there and we'll be like, all right, time to go to your kennel because we're going somewhere. And he won't even like look at us. He'll just, because dogs have realized, and I know what that means. He ain't very happy. I've heard the groaning of the Israelites. They're complaining, whom the Egyptians are forcing to work as slaves. So right now, they're in slavery in Egypt. And he says this, he says, I have remembered my covenant. Now, what this doesn't mean is this doesn't mean that God has short-term memory and God forgot. Sometimes Gina will tell me something and she'll say, I already told you that. And I'll be like, I don't think he told me that. She's like, no. Like, I already told you that multiple times. And I'll sit there and I'll think and I'll be like, did you really tell me this? And she's like, yes, I really told you that. And I told you that like 3 times. And I'm like, I'm only 32 and I can't even remember something you told me 3 times in the last 2 weeks. Is that a husband thing, or am I the only one that does that? Okay. Anyway, yeah, he's my guy. He's like, yeah, that's me too. So I just nod my head and I'm like, sure, yeah, I remember. But anyways, here, it doesn't mean that God got dementia or God forgot. This is what it means. It means that God has now decided to fulfill his covenant and act on his obligation to his people. God had years before said, I'm going to take you into Canaan. Now God has remembered. Now God has said, now I'm going to act and I'm going to take you to this place. And look, he says that he's going to do it. Check out verse number 6. Verse 6 and 7 is incredible. Therefore, tell the Israelites. So God's telling Moses to tell the people this. I am the Lord. This is who I am. And I will bring you out from the forced labor of the Egyptians and rescue you from the slavery to them. Check it. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and great acts of judgment. Verse number 7, he says, I will take you as my people. I will be your God. You will know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from the forced labor of the Egyptians. They're in a very undesirable place. And this is what God says. God says, I'm going to do this in your life. And sometimes God allows us to go to a place so low and bring us to a place where we are so destitute that it causes us to seek God. And it takes us to a place where if we're able to get out of this, we know it's only God that can do it. And right now, they're in a place where they're in Egypt, they're in bondage, they have no hope, they're working 12-hour days, 7 days a week in the Egyptian heat, they're doing all this stuff. And there is no hope. And there is no place where they can turn. There's nothing that gives them an idea of good things are on the horizon. No matter how many positive vibes they got, things aren't going to get better. Until God says, I will act. Sometimes God allows us to be at a low place because it's when we're at our low place and when we're destitute that it's then we open our eyes to God, and it's then God reaches down and God pulls us out and God says, watch what I can do in your life. I will take you. I will be your God. Verse number 8, he's not done. I will bring you to the land that I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will give it to you as a possession. I am the Lord. I am a promise keeper. This is what I'm going to do. Now, consider this. If you're in the place where the Egyptians are, or where the Israelites are in Egypt, and God says, I'm about to work on your behalf. I'm about to do great things. Yes or no, would you be excited? Yeah, you'd be excited. Like, you'd be thrilled. You'd be like, this is great. Check out the response of the people. Shocking. Verse number 9. Moses told this to the Israelites, but they didn't listen to him because of their broken spirit and hard labor. These people were so overwhelmed by life. Life was so hard, life was so difficult, that they didn't have soft hearts to believe that God wanted to do something in their lives. Now, a couple chapters earlier, they did have soft hearts towards God. Look what it says in Exodus 4, verse 31. This is just 2 chapters before. The people, these are the same people, they believed when they heard from God. And when they heard that the Lord had paid attention to them and that he had seen their misery, what did they do? They knelt low, they humbled themselves, and worshiped. At one time, they were at a place where they could receive from God, where for our world, they opened up the Bible and it was like, man, God, you're speaking to me. God, what can I do? Man, God, you're speaking to me. It's causing me to love you more. They had this heart that was receptive to spiritual things. But Exodus chapter 6, life had hardened them. Exodus chapter 6, they are cynical. Exodus chapter 6, their hearts are hardened to spiritual things because of life had kicked them in the rear end. Sometimes we can be right where they are. In a few verses later in Exodus chapter 6, we're not going to have them on the screen for sake of time. But Moses told God, hey, God, I just told the people what you told me, and they were not having it. What do I do now, God? And this is what God told Moses. God said, look at who I am. Look at who I am, and I'm going to work in spite of those people. Sometimes life can be hard. Sometimes we can be hit with things that are difficult and overwhelm us. In the last 10 days, I got some news that just hit me like that, man. I just got some news that just that was totally shocking. I'm a part of a little pastors network, and one of the leaders in the pastors network that's been a part of this network for a while, because of some moral things, he was removed from the pastors network as a leader, and also he had to resign from his role as a lead pastor in a church. And this guy, I wouldn't say that I'm super close to him, but he did the premarital counseling for me and my wife, and gave us some incredible counsel, and we met for hours with him. And a few years ago, he was trying to get me to go work on staff at their church, and I had a relationship with this guy, and to find out that over the last few years, things have not been how they've appeared to be. And somebody that I looked to and somebody that was an example to me has fallen. And to be honest, it's really shaken me. How did this happen? That's one side of me. The other side of me is like, if it could happen to this individual, it could happen to me. And it's been hard. Somebody asked me last week at church. They were like, how you doing? First gave the pat answer, I'm doing good. And then I was like, no, I'm just going to tell them how I'm doing. And I kind of shared just a little bit about this in a nutshell. And in that moment, that person ministered to me. And that person counseled me, and they didn't even realize it. This is what they said. Man, I can only imagine the bewilderment and shock that you're experiencing. But I know that God can see you through this because of who he is. And really, the conversation was about 45 seconds. It wasn't very long. But that person in our church, just by sharing a word, just by reminding me of who God is, just by reminding me that my eyes can't be on man, but my eyes have to be on God, can I just say, it just really strengthened me. And it really helped me. And sometimes it's funny in a church, we think the only person that can minister to people is the pastor. No, I'm just one piece of the body. I'm just one part of this. And what happened is that person encouraged me because they pointed me to God. Now, there's two reasons why it's so important that we remember who God is. There's two reasons that it's so important that like the children of Israel, that we can see who God is. The first reason is this, because number one, trusting God completely comes from seeing God accurately. You will never be able to trust God completely until you see him accurately. Before God told Moses, do something, he says, look at who I am. Realizing, folks, that we need Jesus comes from seeing God as holy. For most of us, we see ourselves as pretty good people, right? As long as we're comparing ourselves to people that are worse than us. If I ask you, are you a good person? Yes. What makes you a good person? Immediately, I would never do, or how about this? You ever watch the news and you think, person's a moron? Have you ever gone through your social media? Maybe you saw a video or something. You're like, why are they doing that? I wouldn't do that. And a lot of times we think that we're good people, and we are if we're comparing ourselves to other people. But the problem is that's not the standard. The standard is God's holiness. The standard of righteousness, the scripture says, there is none righteous, no, not one, is who God is. And because God's holy, we fall woefully short, which is why we need salvation, which is why we need Jesus. And salvation happens, trusting Jesus happens when you realize that we are sinners, that we are not good people. and that we need his forgiveness. And then when we trust Jesus for salvation, this is the beginning of trusting him in every single area of our lives. But this is where that begins. It begins with seeing God accurately. J.D. Greear says this in his book, Not God Enough. He says, spiritual life does not come from discipline or mastering doctrine. It comes from a divine vision of who God is. That growing spiritually doesn't come from like, okay, I'm going to tighten up my bootstraps and I'm going to get better and I'm not going to do this anymore. No. It just comes from seeing God for who he is, because when we see his greatness, we don't need to be our arms twisted to love Jesus. We just will. And as we see Jesus for who he is, as we learn to trust him in our lives, as we see that he's faithful, this is what will happen. Our faith will grow because of this. Because faith produces more faith. Because when you see what God can do, it will cause you to trust God in greater ways and for greater things. Faith produces more faith. When you see what God can do, it will cause you to trust God in greater ways and for greater things. This is why the Christian life is just a journey. It's us learning to take a step. It's like, oh, God came through here. Take another step. Oh, God came through here. And sometimes what we do is we look at people that are way down the road, like we see them as super spiritual, and we're way back there, and you're like, how did they, I'm here, they're here. What happened? We just took steps of faith, and we've learned that we can trust God. And it began with trusting God for salvation, and now I can trust God in this area of my life, in this area of my life. One of the areas that I have learned that I can actually really trust God, that's grown my faith in few other ways, is the area of our personal finances. And it's funny, we were talking as elders this past week, and we're like, as a church, the last few months, we don't even hardly ever talk about money anymore. But we have learned this, that financial giving isn't about money, but it's about our heart. It's about my heart. And I have learned this, that God is trustworthy enough to give to him financially in a God-honoring way, even in difficult times, because God can come through. There's been 2 or 3 times in our marriage where we were in a really tight spot financially. And it wasn't because of financial mismanagement, but it was because of life, if you know what I'm saying. And in those moments, we made the decision that we're still going to give. And literally in miraculous ways that I can't even begin to tell you. In miraculous ways, two or three times in our 6.5-year marriage, God came through. And I'm telling y'all, so crazy. Like, it's like these moments where it's like, oh my goodness, God, I just trusted you and you provided in ways I can't even explain. And then what that does is that allows me to take the next step of faith when the bigger issue's happening, because I've seen God come through in this way. And what will happen in your life is if you will take steps of faith that come from seeing God for who he is, it will produce more faith. Because when you see what God will do, it will cause you to trust God in greater ways and for greater things. And the greatest enemy of faith is forgetfulness. Because when you forget what God has done, you'll stop believing what he will do. I'm just going to say, like right now, we live in a world where there's so much stuff out there that we can forget who our God is, and we can forget what he's done in the past, and it can cause us to doubt the future, and it can cause us to say, I don't know how we're going to make it. And friends, we got to remember what God has done. We got to remember who God is. We got to remember that he came through in the past, and he will come through in the present and in the future. And this is why we can boldly declare that we are not going to be shaken by fear. Why? Because of what God's done and what he will continue to do. That wasn't in the notes. We will trust God completely when we see God accurately. But number 2, and we're done, is this. Having confidence to live for God's purposes comes from seeing God accurately. God told Moses that he wanted him to do something for him because of who he was. But Moses didn't have confidence to live for God's purposes. And most of us in this room, can we get the next slide up? Most of us in this room, thank you. Most of us in this room In fact, all of us, we have a little bit of an insecurity. This is what insecurity is. Insecurity is the voice that says, I am not enough. I am not enough. Next slide up. Whether it's I am not young enough, I'm not pretty enough, I'm not smart enough, I'm not capable enough, I'm not skilled enough. And to some extent, you have something that you fill in the blank, if you're honest. And right now, what's coming to your mind might make you a little insecure to even think about it. You might be feeling, I don't want to think about this. Now, this is what our world says when we have insecurity. It's the opposite of insecurity is confidence, insecurity. And how do we find that? This is what our world will tell you. Discover the great things about yourself by looking inside and tap into your potential. Honestly, as I look deeper inside of me, I'm like, oh, that's not really pretty. If I'm honest, like if I'm self-aware. But this is not biblical. Biblical confidence comes by seeing how great God is, by embracing who he says you are and living for his purposes. Somebody write that down. Somebody take a picture. Somebody tweet it. Somebody Instagram it. This is biblical confidence. By seeing how God great is, how great God is. God appeared to Moses. He said, I am this. Embracing who he says you are. God told Moses, this is what you're going to do. This is who you are. And then you live for his purposes. As a church over the next several weeks, I'm so looking forward to the series that we're going to embark on next week called Good News. And I hope everybody will be here because I'm going to challenge us as a church to have confidence in one area of our Christian life. And that is sharing the good news of Jesus with other people. And what we're going to encourage every person in our church to do, don't be fearful, don't be insecure, is that you will find one person that you can share your faith with. And next week, what we're going to do is this is a little sneak peek to next week. We're going to give every single person one of these cards. Everybody say, ooh. Right? Aren't you impressed? So these cards are called Who's Your One? And there's some scriptures attached. And we're going to invite you to write down the name of one person that you can share your faith with. One person that maybe you can invite to church. One person that maybe you can invite to Community Sunday that's coming up in just a couple weeks. And this is going to be a time where we can just invite people, where we can bring that one. And what we're going to challenge us as a church to do is to move with confidence into the future, for you to move with confidence into what God is leading you to do, for you to move with confidence in trusting God because of who God is. And we want to do this corporately as a body, but we want to do this individually too. So this is my question as we're done this morning. What area of your life do you need to trust God and take a step in that you're having a hard time doing? What place in your spiritual life do you need to move forward with confidence? Maybe it's that relational challenge. Maybe it's that personal issue that you're facing. And maybe you don't have confidence, and maybe you're like, I don't know if I can do this. But if you would just get a view of who God is, if you would just see him accurately, you can move forward. Because trusting God completely begins with seeing God accurately. Let me pray for us this